In this video, we'll take a look at adding inputs to OTLs. But before we get into that, let's take a look at one of the weaknesses of this setup. So it's great that we can create these control points, and we have all these great parameters that allow us to control our setup, but the problem with this is that the attributes that these control point OTLs create have to be used in a very specific way to actually make particles do anything. So it'd be nice if we had another OTL that encapsulated this part of the setup. And this is the part of the setup that actually does the heavy lifting that makes the particles move in the way that we expect from the control points that we've created. So let's just go ahead and make this part an OTL real fast. Now if you remember, we can either hit this button or hit Shift C. So let's collapse into a subnet. That's our first option. I'm just going to go ahead and delete this network box because I don't really need it anymore. Now what I would like you to notice is that even though we collapse this into a subnet, this control point merge here is still connected into the input of the subnet. So how is Houdini actually using this? And notice that our particles still behave as expected. If I hit play, it does what we saw before. So how does Houdini know what to do with this? Well, if we dive into the subnet, you can see these four sort of weird, oddly shaped nodes. And one of them is actually connected into our transfer node here. So basically the way this works is these represent the inputs of your subnet. So this is input number 1, and that's why Houdini wired it in. So this thing comes in here on input number 1, that's this thing, and then it wires it in where that was wired in before we collapsed. When we create an OTL. So let's go ahead and create an OTL real fast. So if we come back up to explosions, and then we need to rename our subnet to something meaningful. So let's call it something like particle controller. And then if you remember how to create an OTL, you right click on a subnet, you say create digital asset. Then once again, I'm going to remove this part that says Robbie here. And notice that Houdini has now set these minimum and maximum inputs fields to 1. And we'll go over what that means later, but for now, just leave those alone. And lastly, we need to pick a place to save it to, so I'm going to put it in my OTLs directory here. Okay. So you'll notice that now instead of 4 inputs, we have 1. That's because we've picked one minimum and maximum input. So if we dive inside of our OTL now, what does it look like? Well, you can see that instead of 4 input nodes like we had here, we now have just 1. And that's because there's only 1 input. So if I were to go over here to the type properties dialog and change maximum inputs to 2, you can see that this other subnetwork input appears. And that's because if we come back out of the OTL, now there's 2 inputs instead of just 1. So what's the difference between minimum inputs and maximum inputs, and why did I only change the maximum inputs? Well, the difference is that basically this is a way of telling Houdini whether or not an input is optional. So if I have 0 minimum inputs and 1 maximum input, that's basically telling Houdini, if we hit apply, that I have this one input here, but the user doesn't actually need to hook anything in there because I can deal with it if there's no input. So basically, it's a way of saying I can give the user a default setting or a default input that makes sense, and then they don't have to hook something in unless they want to control it that way. If you set minimum inputs to 1, then what will happen is, even if the network inside would work fine without an input, Houdini will still error the node and freak out if they don't hook something in. So this is a great way to tell your users what your node is actually expecting. Okay, so that's the way that inputs work. So there's one other thing that I'd like to show you guys, and that's if you middle mouse on this thing, on the input, you'll notice that it says subnetwork input number 1. That kind of sucks. That doesn't really tell you anything. It just says, hey, put an input here. It doesn't tell you what it's actually expecting. So what we can do is we can go to the input output tab, And on this tab, we can actually give our inputs a label. So I could say something like control points. And if I hit apply, now if we middle mouse on the input, it actually says control points. And now the users know exactly what to put in there.